In the foggy dawn of January 5, 1944, as German engineers at Peenemünde hurried to perfect their vengeance weapons, an intelligence report landed on Albert Speer's desk. American anti-aircraft batteries defending London had suddenly achieved impossible hit rates against the V-1 flying bombs. What the Germans initially dismissed as statistical anomaly would soon reveal itself as one of the war's most consequential technological breakthroughs, one that would render Germany's terror weapon largely impotent and signal a devastating reality. America's scientific capability had decisively surpassed the Third Reich's vaunted technological prowess. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The technological chess match between Nazi Germany and the Allies had reached a critical juncture by late 1943. Hitler's regime, increasingly desperate as the strategic bombing of German cities intensified, had placed extraordinary hopes on the Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons, particularly the V-1 flying bomb. These pulse-jet-powered cruise missiles, known to Londoners by their ominous buzzing sound that earned them the nickname buzz bombs or doodlebugs, represented the culmination of German engineering ingenuity and Hitler's desperate desire to strike back at Britain. The V-1 had been conceived at the Peenemünde Army Research Center on the Baltic coast, where Germany's finest scientific minds worked under the direction of Werner von Braun and General Walter Dornberger. Though von Braun's primary focus remained the more sophisticated V-2 ballistic missile, the V-1 flying bomb, designed by Robert Lucer of the Fiesler Company, provided Germany with an immediate terror weapon that could be mass-produced quickly and at relatively low cost. Each V-1 carried a warhead containing 850 kilograms of high explosives capable of leveling an entire city block. For the Nazi leadership, these weapons represented more than mere military assets. They embodied Hitler's promise of wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, that would reverse Germany's deteriorating military position and fulfill his pledge of retaliation against the Allied bombing campaign. The psychological significance of the V-1 campaign transcended its military value, becoming a propaganda tool to bolster German morale even as the Reich faced setbacks on multiple fronts. When the first V-1 struck London on June 13, 1944, just a week after the D-Day landings in Normandy, they created immediate terror. Unlike conventional bombing raids that brought air raid sirens and the opportunity to seek shelter, the V-1s arrived with minimal warning. Their distinctive buzzing engine would abruptly cut out before the missile descended, creating approximately 15 seconds of eerie silence before detonation. This psychological warfare effect was precisely what Hitler had intended: to shatter British morale that had withstood years of conventional bombing. The sudden silence was the most terrifying part, recalled Sarah Jenkins, a London school teacher who survived a V-1 attack that destroyed her neighbor's home in Lewisham. We'd hear that awful buzzing getting louder, then suddenly stop. Everyone would freeze, counting the seconds, wondering where it would hit. It was a special kind of torture, knowing something terrible was about to happen, but not knowing where. The initial British response to the V-1 threat included barrage balloons, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter interceptors. Yet the conventional fuses used in anti-aircraft shells required direct hits or extremely close proximity to destroy the flying bombs, which traveled at speeds of up to 640 kilometers per hour at altitudes between 600 and 900 meters. Even the fastest British fighters struggled to intercept the V-1s, though skilled pilots eventually developed techniques to tip the missiles' wings, disrupting their gyroscopic control systems and sending them crashing prematurely. Across the Atlantic, however, American scientists had been working on a solution that would transform anti-aircraft defense: the proximity fuse, officially designated the VT, variable time fuse. This remarkable device contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver that could detect when a shell came within effective range of a target and detonate automatically, multiplying the effective kill radius of anti-aircraft shells. It represented one of the war's most closely guarded technological secrets, its development considered by some military historians as significant as the atomic bomb or radar. The VT fuse emerged from an intensive research program directed by the National Defense Research Committee and the Office of Scientific Research and Development, led by Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. The technological challenges had been immense. The scientists had to create a miniaturized radio system robust enough to withstand the extreme acceleration of firing, approximately 20,000 Gs, and the high-speed rotation of the shell in flight, up to 500 rotations per second. Moreover, the device required batteries with a stable shelf life, yet capable of powering the system immediately upon firing. "We were asking for the impossible," Dr. James Van Allen, one of the key scientists on the project, later recalled. "We needed to package a sophisticated radio system into something the size of a light bulb, make it survive forces thousands of times greater than gravity, and ensure it would work flawlessly after sitting on a shelf for months or years. And all this using 1940s vacuum tube technology. The industrial production challenge proved equally daunting. The proximity fuse required manufacturing precision previously unseen in mass production, with miniaturized components assembled to exacting tolerances under the strictest security protocols. Crosley Corporation, previously known for producing radios and refrigerators, converted its facilities to manufacture the fuses, eventually producing over 2 million units by war's end. Security surrounding the VT fuse was extraordinary. Workers at production facilities were told they were building radar components with the true purpose of their work compartmentalized to prevent any single person from understanding the complete system. The fuses were initially restricted to naval use in the Pacific, where any duds would fall into the ocean, rather than on land where they might be recovered by enemy forces. President Roosevelt personally approved each expansion of their use, weighing the military advantage against the risk of the technology falling into enemy hands. By late 1943, as the V-1 threat became apparent through intelligence reports, Allied military planners began considering the deployment of VT fuses to Britain. The decision faced opposition from security-minded officials who feared that using the fuses over land would inevitably lead to German acquisition of the technology. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, however, argued forcefully for their deployment, convinced that the lives saved in London outweighed the security risk. Churchill, whose own residence at 10 Downing Street lay within the V-1 target zone, supported Eisenhower's position. In December 1943, after reviewing the classified assessments of the V-1 threat, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt, "The flying bomb represents a grave threat to London's population and British morale at a critical juncture. If your proximity fuse offers a solution, I implore you to authorize its use in our defense. History may well judge this decision as crucial to maintaining the resolve needed for our coming invasion of Europe." Roosevelt approved the transfer of VT fuses to Britain with strict protocols. They would be used only by American anti-aircraft batteries under U.S. command, with British crews restricted from handling the technology. Each unfired shell would be meticulously accounted for, and special recovery teams would attempt to locate any duds that might land in civilian areas. The first shipment of VT fuses arrived in Britain under heavy security in January 1944, with deployment limited to specific American anti-aircraft units positioned around London. The Germans, meanwhile, remained confident in their V-1 campaign. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had prepared extensively to exploit the psychological impact of the vengeance weapons, explicitly connecting them to retaliation for Allied bombing of German cities. Intelligence reports suggested that German leadership believed the flying bombs would be largely unstoppable due to their speed and small radar cross-section, forcing Britain to divert significant resources to civil defense rather than offensive operations. Colonel Walter Dornberger, who oversaw both the V-1 and V-2 programs, expressed this confidence in a January 1944 presentation to Hitler. The flying bomb will strike without warning and with unprecedented precision. The British have no existing defense that can reliably intercept these weapons, which will rain down upon London day and night until their will to continue this war is broken. This German confidence was not entirely misplaced. Initial British defense efforts against the V-1 had proven inadequate. Conventional anti-aircraft fire achieved success rates of only about 20%, even with the aid of radar-directed gun laying. According to Air Marshal Roderick Hill, who commanded the anti-aircraft defenses of Britain, our gunners might as well have been firing blindfolded for all the success they were having against these devices. The situation changed dramatically when American batteries equipped with VT fuses entered action against the V-1s in the summer of 1944. The improvement was immediate and remarkable. Battery B of the 184th AAA Gun Battalion, positioned in Kent along the V-1 flight path to London, recorded the first confirmed VT fuse destruction of a V-1 on June 28, 1944. Within weeks, the success rate of anti-aircraft batteries equipped with the new fuses jumped from 20% to over 70%, a transformation that one British observer described as nothing short of miraculous. As summer progressed, the data became undeniable. In areas defended by conventional fuses, V-1 interception rates remained below 25%. In sectors where American VT-equipped batteries operated, the rates exceeded 80% by August. Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, who would later direct the Manhattan Project, observed a battery in action near Dover and reported, "I witnessed what can only be described as a revolution in anti-aircraft defense." Flying bombs that would have previously passed unscathed through a barrage of conventional fire were being consistently destroyed. The proximity fuse has transformed an ineffective defense into a formidable shield for London. For London's civilians, the impact was profound. Areas under the protection umbrella of VT-equipped batteries experienced dramatically fewer impacts. It was as though a protective hand had been placed over certain parts of the city, recalled Air Raid Warden Thomas Fleming. In my sector in South London, we went from responding to multiple impacts per day to sometimes days without a single hit. We didn't know what had changed, but something clearly had. The German High Command initially interpreted the declining success rate of V-1 attacks as a combination of improved British fighter interception and statistical variation. By August 1944, however, intelligence reports reaching Berlin indicated a systematic change in Allied defensive capabilities. Fragments of destroyed V-1s recovered by German agents in Britain revealed damage patterns consistent with proximity detonation rather than direct hits, raising alarm among German weapons specialists. On August 12, 1944, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, received a comprehensive analysis from Luftwaffe technical experts confirming that the Allies had deployed a new type of fuse. The report stated, "Evidence suggests the Americans have developed and fielded a proximity fuse that detonates based on closeness to the target rather than requiring direct contact. This represents a technological leap beyond current German capabilities and has effectively neutralized the V-1's primary advantage, its small target profile and high speed." Speer immediately ordered an emergency meeting of the Reich Research Council, bringing together Germany's top electronics and ordnance experts. Professor Herbert Wagner of the Henschel Aircraft Company, who had been developing guided missiles, examined the limited intelligence available and concluded, "If the reports are accurate, the Americans have solved problems in miniaturization and ruggedization that our own research program considered theoretically possible but practically unachievable in wartime conditions." This suggests their electronics industry has capabilities substantially exceeding our own. The implications extended beyond the immediate threat to the V-1 campaign for a regime that had built much of its ideological foundation on claims of German technological and scientific superiority. The American proximity fuse represented a profound challenge. The Nazi leadership had consistently assured both the German public and their own military that German science would ultimately prevail through wonder weapons. Now, facing evidence that American technology had leapfrogged their own, the psychological impact within the upper echelons of the Reich was considerable. Hitler, when briefed on the proximity fuse, initially refused to believe the reports. According to Albert Speer's later recollections, the Führer insisted that our scientists examine alternative explanations. He suggested that perhaps the British had deployed additional fighter squadrons or developed new radar systems. The notion that American industry had solved a problem that our own experts deemed nearly impossible did not align with his worldview. For the German scientists and engineers at Peenemünde and other research facilities, the evidence was harder to dismiss. Dr. Ernst Steinhoff, a guidance systems expert working on the V-2 program, reportedly told colleagues after reviewing the intelligence, "If the Americans have indeed mastered proximity fuse technology suitable for anti-aircraft use, we must acknowledge they have surpassed us in a critical area of electronics miniaturization." The implications for guided weapons development are profound. The Nazi regime's response to this technological setback followed a pattern established earlier in the war when confronted with Allied advances. Rather than acknowledging the reality, they intensified propaganda regarding other wonder weapons still in development, particularly the V-2 ballistic missile, which flew too high and fast for any existing interceptor or anti-aircraft system. Goebbels' ministry received instructions to emphasize that the V-2, unlike the V-1, was truly unstoppable and would soon be deployed in numbers that would change the course of the war. Simultaneously, German intelligence services launched an intensive effort to acquire detailed information about the proximity fuse technology. Abwehr agents in Britain received urgent directives to obtain fragments of anti-aircraft shells containing VT fuses, with extraordinary rewards promised for success. The German scientific establishment mobilized resources to attempt to reverse engineer the technology based on the limited information available, but with the Reich's industrial base increasingly disrupted by strategic bombing, practical implementation remained beyond reach, even if the technical details could be obtained. By September 1944, the effectiveness of the VT fuse had forced a fundamental reconsideration of the V-1 campaign. With interception rates exceeding 80% in areas defended by proximity-fused anti-aircraft guns, the strategic value of continuing V-1 launches became questionable. Each missile now had only a 1 in 5 chance of reaching its target, while consuming scarce resources and exposing launch sites to Allied counter-battery fire and bombing. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, convened a strategy meeting on September 10, 1944, to reassess the Vengeance weapons program in light of the proximity fuse challenge. The transcript of this meeting, captured after the war, reveals the growing desperation within the German High Command. The V-1 campaign no longer achieves the strategic effect initially projected, Keitel stated. American proximity fuses have rendered our current design ineffective against defended targets. We must either substantially modify the weapon or shift resources to systems that remain beyond Allied defensive capabilities. General Heinz Guderian, attending the same meeting, argued forcefully for concentrating resources on the Eastern Front rather than continuing the V-1 campaign. Each V-1 requires aluminum that could produce 3 fighter aircraft. Given their limited effectiveness against London now, we must question whether this resource allocation serves Germany's strategic position. Despite these military realities, Hitler's emotional investment in the Vengeance weapons program prevented its outright cancellation. The V-1 launches continued, though increasingly targeted, at Belgian ports like Antwerp rather than London, seeking targets beyond the protection of the dense American anti-aircraft screen. Simultaneously, resources shifted toward accelerating the V-2 program, which promised to bypass the proximity fuse defense entirely through its ballistic trajectory and hypersonic terminal velocity. For German civilians increasingly aware of their nation's deteriorating military position, the failure of the Vengeance weapons to deliver on propaganda promises contributed to eroding morale. Louise Solmitz, a Hamburg schoolteacher, wrote in her diary in October 1944, "We were told these new weapons would force England to its knees and perhaps even end the war. Now we hear that many never reach their targets. If our much-vaunted wonder weapons can be so readily defeated, what hope remains for victory?" The technological battle between the V-1 and the proximity fuse also played out in the calculations of ordinary German citizens attempting to assess their nation's prospects. Richard Overy, the distinguished British historian of World War II, notes that by late 1944, the failure of the Vengeance weapons to significantly impact Britain's war effort became increasingly apparent to the German population, contributing to a growing realization that technological superiority, long a cornerstone of Nazi propaganda, had shifted decisively to the Allies. On the factory floors where V-1 components were manufactured, often by forced laborers and concentration camp, prisoners working under brutal conditions, production continued despite the weapon's diminishing effectiveness. At the Mittelwerk underground factory in the Harz Mountains, where both V-1 and V-2 components were manufactured using slave labor from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, quotas remained unchanged, even as intelligence reports documented the declining success rates. Jean-Michel Caubot, a French resistance member who had been imprisoned at Mittelbau-Dora and assigned to V-weapon production, later testified, "The pace never slackened, even when rumors reached us that the British were shooting down most of the flying bombs. Guards would beat prisoners who repeated such information, calling it defeatist propaganda." But some of the German engineers spoke more openly among themselves, and we could sense their growing desperation as they received modified designs intended to overcome some new Allied countermeasure. For the scientists and engineers of Peenemünde, the proximity fuse represented a sobering revelation about the relative state of German and American technology. Most had genuinely believed in German scientific preeminence, a belief reinforced by the Nazi regime's propaganda and Germany's pre-war leadership in many scientific fields. The reality that American industrial capacity had not only matched but exceeded German capabilities in electronics, miniaturization, and mass production precision came as a profound shock. Walter Dornberger later wrote in his memoirs, "The proximity fuse demonstrated that the Americans had not only caught up to German technology, but had surpassed it in certain critical domains. This was difficult for many of us to accept, having been assured of our technological superiority. It forced a painful reassessment of our capabilities relative to the Allies." Werner von Braun, whose V-2 ballistic missile remained immune to the proximity fuse defense due to its speed and altitude, nonetheless recognized the broader implications. In post-war interviews, he acknowledged, "The proximity fuse was a stunning achievement that demonstrated American technical ingenuity and industrial capability. When we learned of it, I understood that the technological balance had shifted fundamentally. Their ability to miniaturize complex electronics for mass production exceeded anything we had achieved." As autumn 1944 progressed, the military equation surrounding the V-1 campaign grew increasingly unfavorable for Germany. Beyond the proximity fuse challenge, the Allied advance across France had pushed the launch sites in the Pas-de-Calais region out of German control. New launch areas were established in Holland, but these required longer flight paths that provided more opportunity for interception. The longer range requirements also reduced payload capacity, further diminishing the weapon's effectiveness. By November 1944, the evidence of the proximity fuse's impact had become impossible for the German High Command to ignore. A classified assessment prepared for Field Marshal Keitel stated bluntly, "The American proximity fuse has effectively neutralized the V-1 as a strategic weapon against defended targets. In sectors protected by proximity-fused anti-aircraft batteries, fewer than 20% of launched missiles reach their targets." This represents an unacceptable return on the resources invested in the program. Hitler, however, continued to demand the vengeance weapons campaign proceed, viewing it through a political rather than military lens. In a November 18th meeting with Speer and the armaments staff, he insisted, "The psychological impact on both the German and British populations justifies continuing these attacks even at reduced effectiveness. Our people must see that we can still strike at our enemies, and the British must be denied any sense that they are now safe from German retribution." This divergence between military reality and political imperative created significant tension within the German command structure. General Adolf Galland, inspector of fighter aircraft, argued vehemently that the resources devoted to the V-weapons would be better allocated to defending German airspace. Each V-1 contains enough aluminum for 3 fighter aircraft. Given the effectiveness of Allied countermeasures, we are essentially delivering our strategic materials to the enemy with every missile they intercept. For the Allied scientific and military leadership, the success of the VT fuse against the V-1 provided both validation and valuable lessons. Dr. Vannevar Bush, who had overseen American scientific mobilization as director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, viewed the proximity fuse as a prime example of the power of integrating scientific research directly into warfare. In a confidential report to President Roosevelt in December 1944, he wrote, "The victory of the proximity fuse over the V-1 demonstrates the decisive advantage that can be gained through the systematic application of scientific research to military problems. This model of scientist-military collaboration should inform our post-war national security organization." The success also reinforced the Allies' growing confidence in their technological edge over Germany. General Leslie Groves noted in a memorandum regarding the Manhattan Project, "The proximity fuse experience demonstrates that our scientific and industrial capability now substantially exceeds that of Nazi Germany. This should give us confidence that our other advanced technology programs, however challenging, can achieve their objectives before the enemy can develop comparable capabilities." As 1944 drew to a close, the technological chess match between the proximity fuse and the V-1 had revealed a fundamental truth about the shifting balance of the war. Germany, once at the forefront of military technology, now found itself outmatched by American scientific and industrial capability. The proximity fuse, a marvel of miniaturization and mass production precision, had transformed a terrifying new weapon into a largely ineffective drain on Germany's dwindling resources. For ordinary Germans, this reality became increasingly difficult to ignore as the promised results of the vengeance weapons failed to materialize. The gap between Goebbels' propaganda claims and observable reality widened, contributing to the erosion of confidence in the regime's assurances about the war's trajectory. Wilhelm Messerschmitt, a civil engineer in Dresden, confided to his diary in December 1944, "We were told these vengeance weapons would change the course of the war, yet London still stands, and Allied bombing of our cities intensifies. One must question what other promises from our leadership rest on equally hollow foundations." Meanwhile, in London, the psychological impact of the proximity fuse's success was profound. Though the public remained unaware of the specific technology that had so dramatically improved their protection, the visible reduction in successful V-1 strikes restored confidence that had been shaken by the initial onslaught. Air raid shelters that had been continuously occupied during the early phase of the V-1 campaign gradually emptied as Londoners observed the increasing frequency with which flying bombs were destroyed before reaching the city. Prime Minister Churchill, who had followed the development and deployment of the proximity fuse with keen interest, recognized its significance beyond the immediate protection it provided. In a private meeting with his scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, he remarked, "The proximity fuse represents more than a defensive measure. It demonstrates the increasing gap between Allied and German technical capabilities. This gap, perhaps more than any single battle, forecasts the ultimate outcome of this conflict." The new year of 1945 brought further deterioration in Germany's strategic position. With the V-1 campaign effectively neutralized as a threat to London by the combination of VT fuses, fighter interception, and the loss of launch sites in northern France, German planners increasingly shifted focus to the V-2 ballistic missile. Unlike the V-1, the V-2's supersonic velocity and high-altitude trajectory made it immune to interception by any existing Allied defensive system, including proximity fuses. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, assessing the comparative effectiveness of the two weapons in January 1945, concluded, "The V-1, while economical to produce, can no longer achieve significant strategic effect against defended targets. The V-2, though far more resource-intensive, currently faces no effective countermeasure. We must acknowledge this reality in our allocation of increasingly constrained production capacity." Yet even this assessment failed to reckon with the full implications of the proximity fuse for Germany's strategic position. The technology that had proven so effective against the V-1 was being rapidly adapted to other defensive applications. By early 1945, American forces were deploying proximity fuses against German aircraft on the Western Front, dramatically increasing the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire. The technology that had protected London from flying bombs was now shooting German planes from the skies over Belgium and the Rhine. Colonel Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's commando leader who had been involved in special weapons programs, recognized the broader implications. In a February 1945 assessment submitted to the High Command, he warned, "The American proximity fuse represents a fundamental technological advantage that extends beyond the V-1 campaign. This technology, now being applied to multiple domains of warfare, exemplifies the industrial scientific capability gap that has emerged between Germany and the United States. This gap cannot be closed under current circumstances and must be factored into our strategic planning." For German scientists racing to develop countermeasures to the proximity fuse, the challenges proved insurmountable given the deteriorating industrial situation. Dr. Herbert Wagner, leading one such effort at a research facility near Prague, later described the frustration. "We understood the theoretical principles behind the proximity fuse from intelligence reports, but replicating it required precision electronics manufacturing capabilities that were increasingly beyond our reach as Allied bombing disrupted production. We could design counter-systems on paper but lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in quantities that would matter." As the Reich contracted under Allied advances from east and west, the strategic significance of the Vengeance weapons program diminished further. Though V-1 and V-2 attacks continued through March 1945, their impact on Allied operations or morale had become negligible compared to their considerable drain on Germany's remaining resources. Each V-2 in particular required alcohol that could fuel several fighter aircraft, aluminum that could build multiple conventional aircraft, and precision manufacturing capacity increasingly needed for basic weapons production. General Heinz Guderian, in one of his final confrontations with Hitler before being dismissed in March 1945, argued bluntly, "The resources devoted to the Vengeance weapons program now yield no meaningful military return. Each V-weapon launched represents tanks, artillery, and aircraft that are not reaching our collapsing Eastern Front. The program has become a technological indulgence we can no longer afford." For the engineers and scientists of Peenemünde, now evacuated to central Germany as Soviet forces approached the Baltic coast, the proximity fuse stood as a sobering indication of what they were up against. Dr. Ernst Steinhoff, who had worked on guidance systems for both the V-1 and V-2, observed to colleagues in March 1945, "The proximity fuse demonstrates the Americans have achieved a level of electronics miniaturization and mass production precision that we had theorized but failed to implement. This technological gap reflects a fundamental industrial capability difference that transcends any individual weapon system." This assessment was shared by Albert Speer, who had increasingly recognized the insurmountable gap between German aspirations and Allied industrial scientific reality. In his final comprehensive industrial report to Hitler in March 1945, Speer wrote with uncharacteristic bluntness, "The American proximity fuse exemplifies the technological superiority our enemies have achieved. It combines scientific innovation with mass production precision that our war economy, despite all efforts, cannot match." This represents not merely a specific weapon advantage, but a systemic capability differential that has become decisive. Hitler characteristically refused to accept this reality. Even in his final weeks in the Berlin bunker, he continued to speak of secret weapons that would reverse Germany's fortunes, dismissing evidence of Allied technological superiority as defeatism. Yet among the technical and military leadership surrounding him, the lesson of the proximity fuse had been absorbed. American scientific industrial capability had overtaken Germany's, and this fundamental reality, more than any battlefield defeat, had rendered ultimate German defeat inevitable. For the Allied scientific community, the success of the proximity fuse against the V-1 campaign provided validation and lessons that would shape post-war research and development approaches. Dr. Merlo-Tuve, who had directed the proximity fuse development at the Applied Physics Laboratory, reflected in April 1945. The proximity fuse program demonstrated the power of integrating fundamental scientific research with industrial engineering under urgent wartime pressure. This model, combining theoretical innovation with practical implementation, should inform our approach to research organization in peacetime. Dr. Vannevar Bush, architect of America's scientific mobilization during the war, saw in the proximity fuse a template for future national security research. In his influential July 1945 report to President Truman, Science, the Endless Frontier, Bush cited the proximity fuse program as exemplifying the potential of coordinated government-university industry research efforts, writing, "The development of the proximity fuse illustrates how fundamental scientific understanding, when directed towards specific military problems through organized research, can yield decisive advantage. This model should inform our post-war scientific organization." For the tens of thousands of Londoners who had endured the V-1 onslaught, the proximity fuse had brought a reprieve that many recognized as decisive, even without knowing the specific technology involved. Constance Miles, a diarist who documented daily life in wartime London, wrote in February 1945, "The flying bombs that terrified us last summer now rarely reach the city. Whatever new defensive measure has been implemented has transformed our daily reality from constant terror to relative normalcy. This change, perhaps more than any other, has restored our confidence that this war will soon end in victory." The technological battle between the V-1 and the proximity fuse also yielded operational lessons that influenced military doctrine on both sides. Allied air defense planners recognized that layered defensive systems, combining fighter interception with proximity-fused anti-aircraft batteries, created synergistic effects greater than either approach alone could achieve. This concept would influence air defense doctrine throughout the Cold War, with proximity-fused technology evolving into increasingly sophisticated radar-guided missile systems. For German military thinkers who survived the war, the proximity fuse experience underscored the limits of technological superiority in specific weapon systems when facing an adversary with greater industrial scientific depth. General Adolf Galland, who had argued against resource allocation to the V-weapons program, reflected in his post-war memoirs. The V-1 campaign demonstrated that even innovative weapon systems can be rapidly countered when the enemy possesses both scientific insight and industrial capacity to implement countermeasures at scale. Germany's failure to recognize this reality contributed significantly to our defeat. By war's end, the statistics told the story of this technological contest definitively. Of approximately 10,000 V-1s launched against Britain, fewer than 2,500 reached their targets. In areas defended by proximity-fused anti-aircraft batteries, interception rates had reached 90% by March 1945, effectively nullifying the weapon as a strategic threat. The proximity fuse had transformed a terror weapon that had once threatened to break London's morale into a largely ineffectual drain on Germany's dwindling resources. The human impact of this technological battle extended far beyond military calculations. For Londoners like Emily Preston, a nurse at Guy's Hospital who had treated victims of early V-1 strikes, the difference was measured in lives saved. In June and July 1944, our wards were continuously filled with casualties from the flying bombs. By autumn, the number of new cases had fallen dramatically. Whatever changed in our defenses saved countless lives and allowed us to focus on treating the wounded from the front rather than civilian casualties. For the forced laborers who produced V-1 components in the underground factories of Mittelbau-Dora, where thousands died from starvation, disease, and mistreatment, the proximity fuse represented a bitter irony. Marcel Bolayert, a French political prisoner who survived the camp, later testified, "We were worked to death producing these weapons and then learned they were being shot down before reaching their targets. Yet production quotas never decreased. The futility of our forced labor made the cruelty of our situation even more pronounced." The technological battle between the V-1 and proximity fuse also cast a long shadow into the post-war world and the emerging Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the strategic significance of German missile technology, leading to the well-documented race to capture German scientists and engineers as the Reich collapsed. Operation Paperclip brought Wernher von Braun and his team to America, while Soviet forces secured other German rocket specialists for their own program. Less widely acknowledged, however, was how the proximity fuse experience influenced post-war German perspectives on technology and warfare. Carl Becker, a junior engineer on the V-1 program who later became prominent in West Germany's defense industry, observed in a 1970 interview, "The proximity fuse demonstrated that technological sophistication in a single weapon system cannot compensate for broader industrial scientific capability gaps." This lesson significantly shaped West German defense planning during the Cold War, emphasizing integration with Allied technological systems rather than pursuing independent wonder weapons. The implications extended beyond military planning into the scientific and industrial reconstruction of post-war Germany. Ludwig Erhard, architect of West Germany's economic miracle, explicitly referenced the proximity fuse case in a 1951 policy paper on research funding. The American development of the proximity fuse demonstrated an integration of scientific research with industrial application that Germany must emulate. Our future economic competitiveness depends on rebuilding this connection between fundamental research and practical implementation that was misdirected during the Third Reich. For American strategic planners entering the Cold War, the proximity fuse stood as evidence that technological advantage required both scientific innovation and industrial capacity to implement that innovation at scale. General Leslie Groves, transitioning from his leadership of the Manhattan Project to advising on post-war security organization, emphasized this lesson in a 1946 planning document. The proximity fuse and atomic bomb projects demonstrate that scientific breakthrough alone is insufficient. The capacity to engineer and mass-produce complex technologies at wartime urgency represents a distinct strategic advantage that must be maintained in peacetime. The scientists and engineers who had created the proximity fuse found their wartime experience shaping their post-war careers and perspectives. James Van Allen, who had helped solve the critical problem of miniaturizing the proximity fuse's radio components, applied similar skills to developing scientific instruments for America's early space program, ultimately discovering the radiation belts around Earth that now bear his name. The organizational approaches pioneered at the Applied Physics Laboratory during proximity fuse development became templates for Cold War research institutions like Rand Corporation and MITRE. For the survivors of the V-1 attacks on London, the proximity fuse represented a turning point that many recognized even without knowing the specific technology involved. Margaret Wilson, who had lost her sister to a V-1 strike in Deptford during the early phase of the campaign, recalled in a 1995 interview, "By autumn, we began to feel protected again. We could watch the doodlebugs being shot down before they reached the city. That feeling that someone had found a way to shield us restored a sense of hope that had been badly shaken that summer." The full story of the proximity fuse remained classified for years after the war, with many details not released until the 1960s, and some aspects remaining restricted until the 1970s. When the technical achievements finally became public knowledge, many were astonished by the sophistication of what had been accomplished under wartime pressure using 1940s technology. Dr. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, remarked after reading the declassified proximity fuse technical reports, "What those engineers achieved with vacuum tubes and primitive electronics, working against extraordinary constraints, represents one of the most impressive engineering feats of the war. That this was accomplished while maintaining absolute secrecy makes it all the more remarkable." The tale of the proximity fuse versus the V-1 also illuminates a broader historical pattern. Technological advantages in warfare are often temporary, as adversaries develop countermeasures leading to cyclical innovation. Had the war continued longer, German engineers might eventually have developed V-1 variants less vulnerable to proximity fuses, perhaps flying higher, faster, or incorporating radar-absorbing materials. The proximity fuse itself would later be countered by electronic warfare measures designed to confuse or jam its radio signals, which in turn led to more sophisticated fuse designs. This cycle of measure and countermeasure continues in modern warfare, with each technological advantage creating pressure for adversaries to develop responses. Brigadier General Terence Povey, addressing a NATO Defense Technology Symposium in 2002, explicitly referenced the proximity fuse case. The VT fuse versus V-1 contest exemplifies the eternal cycle of technological warfare. Today's decisive advantage becomes tomorrow's vulnerability as adversaries adapt. The lesson for modern defense planners is that technological superiority requires continuous innovation rather than reliance on any single breakthrough. In strategic studies, the proximity fuse case has become a classic example of asymmetric advantage, where one side achieves superiority not through matching the opponent's innovation directly, but by developing an effective countermeasure. Andrew Marshall, the influential director of the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment, frequently cited the case in his analyses of technological competition between the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War, noting, "The proximity fuse did not attempt to match the V-1's capabilities, but rather exploited its fundamental vulnerability." This oblique approach to technological competition often yields more decisive results than direct emulation of an adversary's systems. The battlefield impact of the proximity fuse extended well beyond the defense of London. By 1945, proximity-fused artillery shells were being used with devastating effect against German ground forces on the Western Front. During the Battle of the Bulge, proximity-fused artillery proved particularly effective against troop concentrations, with shells exploding at optimal height above ground, rather than burying themselves before detonation. General George Patton described this application as the most important development in artillery in this war. After the Allied crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire became increasingly effective against the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft. The combination of Allied air superiority and improved anti-aircraft defenses created a nearly impenetrable umbrella over advancing Allied forces. Luftwaffe pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the most decorated German serviceman of the war, noted in his post-war memoirs, "By spring 1945, flying over Allied positions had become nearly suicidal. Their anti-aircraft fire seemed to have acquired an uncanny accuracy, with shells exploding precisely where they would cause maximum damage rather than requiring direct hits." The technological disparity exemplified by the proximity fuse affected German morale at multiple levels. For senior military leaders with access to classified intelligence, it represented concrete evidence of America's emerging technological superiority. For ordinary German citizens, the failure of the vengeance weapons to deliver the promised reversal of fortunes contributed to growing disillusionment with Nazi leadership. As Richard Overy noted in his analysis of German collapse, the gap between propaganda promises about wonder weapons and observable reality became increasingly apparent to the German population through 1944-45, contributing significantly to the erosion of regime credibility. For Werner von Braun and other senior German rocket scientists, the proximity fuse experience influenced their post-war integration into American research establishments. They arrived not as representatives of superior German technology, but as contributing experts to an American scientific industrial complex that had demonstrated its capabilities. Von Braun, who would go on to lead rocket development for the U.S. Army and later NASA, explicitly acknowledged this reality in a 1956 memo to his American supervisors. The proximity fuse program demonstrated American capabilities in electronics, miniaturization, and mass production precision that exceeded anything we had achieved in Germany. This technological foundation provides advantages that will be crucial to satellite and missile development. In London, physical evidence of the V-1 campaign and the proximity fuse defense remains visible today in the form of buildings damaged but not destroyed by flying bombs shot down before they could reach their targets. Architectural historian Olivia Horsfall Turner observed in a 2018 survey, "Throughout South London particularly, one can still identify buildings bearing characteristic shrapnel damage patterns from V-1s intercepted by proximity-fused shells. These marks in Portland stone and London brick stand as physical testimony to a technological battle fought in the skies over southeast England." The development and deployment of the proximity fuse also revolutionized post-war approaches to technology transition from laboratory to battlefield. The speed with which the complex device moved from theoretical concept to mass-produced weapon system, less than 3 years, established new expectations for wartime innovation cycles. Secretary of Defense cited the proximity fuse case in establishing the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency's aggressive timeline expectations. The proximity fuse program demonstrated that with proper organization and prioritization, complex technologies can move from concept to deployment in dramatically compressed timeframes during national emergencies. The proximity fuse's impact extended beyond its immediate military application to influence broader technological development pathways. William Perry, who would later serve as U.S. The miniaturization techniques pioneered for fitting sophisticated electronics into artillery shells directly influenced post-war miniaturization efforts in commercial electronics. Dr. William Shockley, co-inventor of the transistor at Bell Labs in 1947, acknowledged this lineage. The extreme miniaturization requirements of the proximity fuse program pushed vacuum tube technology to its absolute limits, creating both technical solutions and a clear recognition of the need for fundamental alternatives. This context significantly influenced our thinking about solid-state electronics. For the German scientists and engineers who had worked on the V-weapons programs, the post-war reckoning with Allied technological achievements prompted professional soul-searching. Walter Thiel, a propulsion specialist who had worked at Peenemünde and later joined the French rocket program, reflected in a 1962 technical memoir. The proximity fuse represented technological sophistication we had assumed beyond Allied capabilities. Its success forced many of us to recognize that our confidence in German technical superiority had been misplaced. This recognition, painful as it was professionally, ultimately benefited our post-war work by instilling greater humility and openness to external developments. As the Cold War intensified, both superpowers incorporated lessons from the proximity fuse versus V-1 contest into their strategic planning. The Soviet Union, having captured both German V-weapon technology and examples of American proximity fuses, recognized the crucial importance of developing robust air defense systems against potential American air attacks. The elaborate Soviet air defense network that emerged by the 1960s with multiple redundant systems reflected this strategic priority born partly from analyzing the effectiveness of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. In the United States, the proximity fuse experience influenced the emerging military-industrial complex in multiple ways. The successful coordination between university laboratories, government oversight, and private manufacturing established organizational patterns that would characterize Cold War weapons development. The Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, which had led proximity fuse development, continued as a key institution bridging academic research and military application, ultimately contributing to technologies from guided missiles to spacecraft. The intellectual property arrangements developed for wartime proximity fuse production, where patents were held by the government but licensed to multiple manufacturers, established precedents for managing innovation in national security contexts. Patent attorney Gerald J. Mossinghoff, who later served as Commissioner of Patents and Trademarks, noted in a legal history, "The proximity fuse program established pragmatic approaches to intellectual property in national security contexts that balanced inventor recognition with broad manufacturing access, creating models still relevant to defense acquisition." For the tens of thousands of workers who had manufactured proximity fuses at converted consumer goods factories, the experience demonstrated American industry's capacity for rapid adaptation. The Crosley Corporation, which had shifted from producing radios and refrigerators to manufacturing precision electronic fuses, exemplified this flexibility. In post-war industrial planning, this demonstrated adaptability influenced concepts of industrial mobilization, with Department of Defense planners developing formal systems to identify civilian manufacturing capabilities that could be rapidly converted to military production if needed. The story of the proximity fuse versus the V-1 also reveals the human dimensions of technological warfare, how innovations created in laboratories directly affected the lives of millions. For Londoners who had endured the Blitz only to face a new terror weapon in 1944, the proximity fuse provided protection that allowed daily life to continue amid war's devastation. Edith Cupp, who worked as a telephone operator throughout the war, described the psychological impact. "When the doodlebugs first came, it seemed we faced a new kind of horror without defense. By autumn, watching them being shot down regularly before they could reach us restored our confidence that this war could be won." That feeling that science was now protecting us mattered enormously to morale. For the German civilians increasingly subjected to Allied bombing as the war progressed, the failure of the vengeance weapons to deliver the promised retaliation intensified a sense of vulnerability and abandonment. Emma Becker, who lived in Hamburg through the war, wrote in her post-war memoirs, "We were told these weapons would force the British to stop bombing our cities. When this clearly failed to happen and Allied bombing instead intensified through 1944 and 1945, many recognized that the regime's promises of wonder weapons were empty. This realization contributed to the sense that we had been misled about many aspects of the war. The technological contest between the V-1 and the proximity fuse also illuminates how wartime innovation often accelerates peaceful technological development. The challenges of miniaturizing reliable electronics for proximity fuses advanced fields from circuit design to battery technology, component packaging, and environmental hardening. These advances found post-war applications in everything from commercial aviation to medical devices. Dr. Charles Stark Draper, the influential MIT engineer who pioneered inertial navigation systems, noted in a 1960 lecture, "The proximity fuse program demonstrated that seemingly impossible technical requirements, when pursued with adequate resources and urgency, often yield solutions that transform not just the immediate application, but entire technological fields." As time distances us from World War II, the story of the proximity fuse versus the V-1 offers enduring insights about technological competition in warfare. Unlike more famous technologies like radar or the atomic bomb, the proximity fuse represented not a single breakthrough, but the sophisticated integration of existing principles with manufacturing innovation to create a decisive advantage. This pattern, where victory goes not necessarily to those with the most dramatic innovations, but to those who can effectively implement and scale complex technologies, continues to characterize modern military technical competition. The proximity fuse also demonstrates how defensive technologies can be as decisive as offensive ones, a lesson sometimes overlooked in military history that typically celebrates offensive breakthroughs. The fuse effectively neutralized the V-1 threat, not through counterattack, but through protection, saving countless civilian lives and preserving British morale at a critical juncture of the war. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who had directed the Battle of Britain in 1940, observed after the war, "The proximity fuse ranks alongside radar as a defensive technology that fundamentally altered the strategic equation by denying the enemy an expected advantage." Such defensive innovations, though less celebrated than offensive weapons, often contribute equally to victory. For historians of technology, the proximity fuse represents a case study in how wartime necessity can overcome seemingly insurmountable technical challenges. The requirements for miniaturization, reliability under extreme conditions, and mass production precision all seemed beyond the technological capabilities of the early 1940s. Yet through focused effort and institutional cooperation, these barriers were overcome in less than 3 years. Thomas Hughes, the distinguished historian of technology, observed, "The proximity fuse development demonstrates how the boundaries of technical possibility are often defined less by fundamental physical limitations than by organizational capacity to mobilize resources and talent toward specific objectives." The human cost of this technological battle extended beyond the direct casualties of the V-1 attacks. The Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where approximately 20,000 prisoners died producing V-weapons components in underground tunnels, stands as a grim reminder of how the Nazi regime's pursuit of vengeance weapons became intertwined with its genocidal apparatus. Jean Michel, a French resistance member who survived imprisonment at Mittelbau-Dora, later testified, "While American scientists worked to defeat the flying bombs, we prisoners were dying by the thousands to produce them." This technological war had a human cost on both sides that should never be forgotten. By April 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany from east and west, the V-weapon campaigns had effectively ended. The last V-1 struck England on March 29, 1945, and the final V-2 attack occurred the same day. With launch sites overrun and production facilities captured or destroyed, the vengeance weapons campaign concluded not with the strategic impact Hitler had envisioned, but with confirmation of Germany's technological defeat. When Allied technical intelligence teams examined captured German research facilities in the war's final weeks, they discovered numerous projects aimed at countering or evading proximity fuses. These included proposals for V-1 variants with radar-absorbing coatings, electronic countermeasures to jam fuse signals, and flight path modifications to reduce vulnerability. None had progressed beyond early development, constrained by Germany's collapsing industrial capacity and the fundamental challenge of competing with American electronics expertise. Dr. R.V. Jones, the brilliant British scientist who had directed scientific intelligence efforts against German secret weapons, assessed these findings in May 1945. The German countermeasures against proximity fuses remained largely theoretical rather than practical. This illustrates a crucial aspect of technological warfare. The side with greater scientific industrial depth can often sustain innovation cycles that overwhelm an opponent with more limited resources, regardless of initial technological leads. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the proximity fuse story remained largely classified, with public attention focused on more visible technologies like radar and the atomic bomb. Yet for military planners assessing the technological lessons of the war, the proximity fuse case provided crucial insights about the integration of scientific research with industrial mobilization that would shape Cold War defense organization. Vannevar Bush, submitting his influential report, Science: The Endless Frontier, to President Truman in July 1945, cited the proximity fuse program as exemplifying the potential of coordinated government-university industry research. The remarkable success of developments like the proximity fuse demonstrates the power of organizing scientific talent towards specific objectives under conditions of adequate support and urgency. Our post-war scientific organization should preserve this capability while returning to the principles of open research that ultimately underpin technological progress. For the scientists and engineers who had created this war-winning technology, the victory brought both professional pride and ethical reflection. Merle Tuvey, who had directed the proximity fuse development at the Applied Physics Laboratory, expressed this duality in a 1946 address to new staff. We can take satisfaction in having created a technology that saved countless Allied lives and helped end tyranny. Yet we must also recognize our work as scientists has forever changed the relationship between technology and warfare. This places upon us special responsibilities to consider the implications of our future work. The legacy of this technological battle continues to influence modern warfare. Today's precision-guided munitions, though vastly more sophisticated, incorporate fundamental principles pioneered in proximity fuses. Smart anti-aircraft systems that protect cities and military installations around the world descend directly from the defensive technology that saved London from V-1s. When Israel's Iron Dome system intercepts incoming rockets, it employs advanced descendants of the technology first deployed against flying bombs in 1944. Perhaps most significantly, the proximity fuse versus V-1 contest established enduring patterns in how democracies mobilize scientific and industrial resources in national emergencies. The organizational models developed, coordinating academic research, government direction, and private manufacturing toward urgent objectives, have been repeatedly deployed in subsequent crises, from the Cold War to modern pandemic response. As we reflect on this technological battle from the perspective of the 21st century, the proximity fuse stands as testament to how human ingenuity, when organized effectively, can create solutions to seemingly insurmountable challenges. The scientists, engineers, and workers who created this technology demonstrated how innovation, adaptability, and determination can overcome even the most sophisticated threats. Their achievement not only helped save London, but demonstrated a model of technological mobilization that helped shape the modern world.